welcome back to the Charleston Forum's virtual programming in 2020. My name is Brittany Sease. For those of you just joining for the first time, I'm a new member on the board of the Charleston Forum. Today, I'm humbled to introduce the moderator and panelists for the Charleston Forum's next topic in our virtual programming in 2020. Please note that the Charleston Forum is a nonprofit organization and sponsors are the only way we can continue our work in the community. Visit thecharlestonforum.com and select the drop-down link to donate if you're able. Please also share our mission and link on our website and social media with all of your contacts who may be interested. The more people we can reach, the greater impact we can have. As a quick refresher, on June 14th, in commemoration for our community members lost at Mother Emanuel 5 years ago, and in recognition of the 350th anniversary of Charleston's founding, the Charleston Forum revealed the results of a survey showing the attitude residents in our Tri-County area have on issues of race. The survey commemorates the Charleston Forum's principal topics of education, economics, policing and criminal justice, and the future of the past. Some of you may have seen the survey results and in-depth coverage from several Post and Courier stories. Following the August discussion on the first topic of policing and criminal justice, the Forum is continuing to focus on one topic each month while getting the survey results to the people and policymakers in our community to get their reactions and proposals, and then bring those proposals to fruition. If you missed our virtual discussion in August with Chief Burgess and Chief Reynolds, you can view that discussion or others on YouTube, thecharlestonforum.com, or the Charleston Forum Facebook page. So if you're on our Facebook page, if you have Facebook, go ahead and give the forum a follow to stay up to date. If you have not seen the full survey and would like to view it, the report is under the 2020 drop-down menu on the Charleston Forum website at thecharlestonforum.com. If you are watching on Zoom, please pose any questions through the Q&A feature. As always, we encourage you to send your input to info@thecharlestonforum.com. Keep in mind that this is a community discussion. We want to hear from you and we want you involved. Now, without further ado, I'm eager to continue the discussion this month with the topic of economics and housing. Today's panel discussion will focus on the low-income housing referendum that will be on the ballot in Charleston County. The referendum emerges amidst a housing and eviction crisis in Charleston County that has been ongoing and has since been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Panelists for today's discussion will be Bil Stanfield, who has helped put the proposal together through his work with the nonprofit Metanoa, County Council member Jenny Honeycutt, and Josh Dix with the Charleston Trident Association of Realtors. To our panelists, welcome and thank you for joining us. As always, I'm proud to have President of MDC, John Simpkin, moderate our discussions. John, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Brittany, and thank you everyone for joining us again for what I hope will be a stimulating and enlightening discussion over the next hour or so about economics and housing in the Tri-County area. I'd like to begin by just referring to a few statistics that come from the Charleston Forum survey that was conducted in March. And that survey touches on a few areas of economic activity and housing that I think are going to be relevant to this discussion. And after I do that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and have each of them just talk a little bit about where they enter into this discussion around economics and housing, and then we'll go from there. So a few points to highlight from the Charleston Forum poll. We're looking at composite numbers around broken systems, both for whites and blacks, as the polling is broken down. 32.8% of whites said that the employment and wages system is broken. 39.7% of blacks reported that the employment and wages system is broken. When it relates to programs to invest in minority communities, 27.1% of whites said that system of investment is broken. 46.9% of blacks reported that system, in their opinion, is broken. And then when we look at the broader question of access to affordable housing, whether there's sufficient affordable housing in Charleston, Berkeley, and Dorchester counties, 25.9% of whites reported that there is sufficient housing, and 20.5% of Blacks reported that there is sufficient housing. So while we may see the systems differently, there seems to be some consensus, roughly a quarter in composite numbers. Only a quarter of the population sees that there's sufficient housing, that there's a housing crisis, there's a housing issue that needs to be addressed. And I'm joined today by three amazing panelists, Josh Dix, Jenny Honeycutt, and Bil Stanfield, and they'll each share with us where they enter into this conversation and what it means to them. So I'm gonna turn it over to Jenny to go first, and just in a couple of minutes, talk to us a little bit about, as a member of Charleston County Council, where do you enter this conversation?
Yes, well, thank you, Bill, and thank you all to the Charleston Forum and all of those joining us. This is a unique position for me. What I am not here to do is advocate for or against the referendum, so I just want to make that clear. Where I do enter the picture as the most recent member of our county council, as one who comes to it newly understanding the affordable housing issues we have in our county and region. Several years ago, Chairman Rawl initiated a committee to actually look into this issue. And from that, there was a task force that developed some ideas and recommendations to the county. And as you all know, on August 11th, the county unanimously approved this ballot measure. And so there's two questions on the ballot. One gives the voters the opportunity to decide whether they want a 2 mil increase, which would raise approximately $8 million per year over a 20-year period for affordable housing. And that money would be restricted to the use of affordable housing. So whatever that looked like, and hopefully we'll delve in with our other panelists as to how those funds can be used. But council unanimously also felt that this was an important issue that needed to be given over to the voters to decide. And so at this point, while I don't take a position, I look forward to learning more about ideas and ways to use those resources. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jenny. And Josh, we'll hear from you next, please.
Yes, sir. I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you all today. I am the Government Affairs Director with the Realtors, and we have been a part of the task force that Ms. Honeycutt mentioned for the past couple of years, working with the county to look at ways to address the affordability crisis that we have here in the metro area. We have a severe lack of inventory across all price points, but specifically at the lowest price point, we need to be producing about 7,500 units per year in order to meet demand, and we haven't met that since 2007, and we need about 2,600 units of that to be affordable, which we produce less than 10% of that a year to meet the demand. So the serious lack of inventory is what really is driving these conversations, and the ability to get folks into homes and at a medium wage that is comfortable for them is a real struggle, and something that we're trying hard to come to terms with and help along the way through policy and as well through the transaction part of real estate.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And Bill, we'll hear from you now.
Yeah, thank you, John. And it's just echo everybody else's sentiments. It's an honor to be a part of this group. I think I come at this, I'm sort of reminded of the first time I ever sort of got aware of this issue. The organization I serve as the CEO of is called Metanoia. We pursue a strategy that works with sort of communities that are typically looked at as purely distressed. We try to find what strengths there are within those communities. We try to invest in those things, so solutions for neighborhoods kind of come from the inside out. And we first did that in a form of after school programming. And when first year we ever had after school programming, we had a couple of very promising young women that we thought there was some, well, frankly, we thought there was some bedwetting issues with them. They were elementary school kids, and I went to their house and they had raw sewage laying under their house. And they had At the time of 2002, they had about a 500 square foot house, and they had a $600 January electrical bill because they had holes in the house. And we knew we couldn't offer a good after school. We could offer the best after school program in the world. And if young people were going home to that, it was going to be all undone. So we began to work in housing. And since then, you sort of fast forward to today, we have developed around a little over 30 units of housing for homeownership, as well as rental affordable housing. And so I sort of, in talking about this, we'll talk about numbers, we'll talk about lots of different structure and all those kinds of, we're glad to respond to those questions, but I just think it's also really important we keep mindful how many people are struggling with this. Just this weekend in our neighborhood here in Socorro, Cherokee, we had an apartment complex, probably a 12, 15 unit apartment complex catch fire, and those folks are getting relief from the Red Cross temporary relief, but they really don't know, you can't find housing in Charleston County that is the price point that they were living at. And now that's 15 units lost to that price point. And so for at least probably months. And so, we come at it from seeing firsthand sort of what people are struggling with, and also seeing how what's changed about our work is I live in Socorro, so we bought my house at a pretty good price a few years ago when nobody else wanted to buy a house here. But now we're getting a postcard every other week. So we're seeing the amount of pressure, economic pressure on communities like ours that is making even communities that were once affordable, less and less affordable to families that are working hard and playing by the rules and need a place to live.
Thanks, Bill. And that actually draws us to one of the other survey questions from the Charleston Forum survey in March, where the question was, are economic pressures forcing Blacks out of neighborhoods? 65.8% of whites responded yes. 73.6% of Blacks also responded in the affirmative. And given these various perspectives that you all bring to this, I'd be interested to hear from any of you, and Josh even referenced that just to keep up with demand, you need to produce 7,500 units per year, and 2,600 of those would need to be affordable. How did we get here? Before we even get to the initiative, give us your perspective on how you think we got into this predicament in the first place. And that's yeah, go ahead, Josh.
To be blunt, it was a lack of planning. We've done great at recruiting from an economic development standpoint. We're growing at 30 people a day, according to the CRDA, but we didn't account for what to do with all these folks once we brought them here to be employed. So we haven't been permitting the units, as I mentioned, and we just haven't had the long-term vision for the housing market that we had for economic development and everything that goes along with it. So we're really starting to see the strain when it comes to a traffic transportation issue, the strain from living close to where these economic centers, these job centers are. And it's really kind of come to a crossroads here on the housing front, because we're now at a point where we just don't have the inventory to meet all the demand that we have. And we're really underserving the lowest sector here with affordable units. And then this is single family detached. This is multi-use condo townhome. We need all of these entry level homes, if you will, in order to meet demand. And we're just not there these days.
So Josh says it's a lack of planning. We put a lot of emphasis in other aspects of our economic development efforts, but assuring access to adequate housing and affordable housing was not one of those. Is that fair?
Yes, sir.
And Jenny and Bill, what do you think? How did we get here?
Well, I would also weigh in, and again, I'm the newest member of council, but it's been 2 years. And one of the huge factors on land scarcity and the lack of units we have is our zoning requirements, parking requirements. When we limit density, when we say you can only have 1 unit per lot, or those types of policies, you're going to have a limited availability. I know the city of Charleston's done a good job of increasing the available units by allowing ADUs in areas. So there are simple planning and zoning type changes we can make to encourage the development of more units, individual units. But again, you have to attack it from all angles. Those units need to be in areas where people don't have to travel far. Otherwise, it just creates more burden on our transportation system. So interestingly, all of these policies from an elected official's standpoint are interrelated. And so all of the things that I do on county council, whether it be an intersection improvement project or a planning or zoning issue, they all are interrelated in a way, which has partly gotten us to this point.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would echo what Ginny says. We certainly understand, even though we're asking everybody to vote yes on the referendum in November, we certainly understand that it is not a silver bullet, and that that zoning, that planning, you know, it's a market. Housing is a market, so supply and demand runs every market, and when your supply is very, very low and you have the high demand, prices go sky high. And I know folks see, you know, lots of housing being built, but when you look at the numbers actually that are needed, we still are lagging. Even with the level of housing we're building, we're lagging behind that. I'd also say, like, we're not doing this issue justice if we don't talk about the history of race and racism and systemic racism in communities within Charleston. I mean, even today, like the median household income for white families as of a couple of years ago in Charleston was, I looked at today, was $64,000, and it was $29,000 for Black families. You know, it's very, very, very hard to find housing if you're making $29,000 a year in Charleston County. You're pretty much resigned to hitting the interstate and drive until you qualify, in which case you're going to spend a lot of your money on transportation expenses. And you're going to spend a lot of time in the car. We had a press release the other day with this coalition, and we had a resident that has been able to move into an affordable unit closer to town, but she was spending 2.5 hours a day trying to get her kids to school at a good school and trying to get them to where they need to be, just because she had to drive somewhere else where she could qualify. And that's what a lot of families, I think, are facing. And it's a continuation of legacies that we've carried forward and haven't done enough to address the fact that these issues hit certain communities harder than others. However, I do think now it's risen to an issue where it's hitting all communities. Mount Pleasant, obligates a gymnasium when they have an emergency, like a hurricane on the way in, because they can't afford to have their fire and police live in their neighborhood in the city. So they have to let people come and camp out. Their emergency workers come and camp out in the gym. And it's hitting everybody across all spectrums, which I think is why it's got to be such a critical, important issue, and why County Council was willing to vote unanimously to put this on the ballot.
Thanks, Bill. And we do have some questions in the Q&A, and you should feel free to add yours if you have any. I'll try to get them and weave them into our conversation as I can. And there are a couple of that have come up that are related that I just want to put to our panelists. First, the use of the word housing. What are we talking about here? We're talking about single family residence, multi-unit housing for ownership or rental, affordable housing that's indexed to income, or housing for lower income people. What is this referendum intending to address when we think of it in terms of housing as an issue?
Well, I'll speak to that initially because I went back and looked at our August 11th minutes today, and it's actually broad enough to address all of this. And so while we focus on, in the language of the referendum, setting up this trust fund, what the funds are designed and how they're designed to use is still to be determined. And that was intentional because what we needed to do was first find the funding source before we could start making all of those decisions and how to spend the money we didn't have. And so again, while I'm not here to advocate for or against the referendum, the intent was to at least set up a pathway that would allow us to do those things. And I know that both Bill and Josh can speak to those in more detail.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Jenny's right. The answer is yes. You listed a whole bunch of things. The answer is yes. All this is intended to be flexible enough for local funding. There are federal dollars flowing to Charleston for some of this work as well. Large low-income housing tax credit projects, apartment complexes, single-family residences. All these things get done, but the problem is that construction land costs have have pushed it to where it's just not really possible to even use those sources in a way that's sustainable and do much volume at all. And so this just increases the capability. It can be used by for-profit, nonprofit developers. There would be a third-party group that will sort of help steward those funds in a way that really can let the best projects rise to the top. The best projects being those who create the best affordability for the longest term for the most people. So that's sort of those of us in this coalition that have helped sort of get this done. Our job does not stop if hopefully the referendum passes. You know, we're going to be working with the county and others to advise and make sure that that whatever process comes forward is transparent, that it does the most good for the most people, and builds the most housing, particularly for vulnerable groups that really can't. You know, the market is not supplying their housing for them.
And the term affordability, we tend to define it as less than 30% of your income going towards housing costs, and that includes either your mortgage or your rent, your electric, your power, water, utilities of that nature, and we want to try to keep all of those costs at 30% of your income. And we're finding that over a third of families just in Charleston County are spending more than a third of their income on just housing costs, and in a lot of cases up near 50% of their income on housing costs. And that's just not a good recipe for having the quality of life that we prescribe and we tout as such a draw towards the Charleston way of life. So that gives you a little context on when we use the term affordable and what we're trying to talk about there.
Thank you, Josh. And I just want to follow up on that. And Josh may have the most insight onto this into the answer to this question, but Bill and Jenny, you may also have some thoughts on this too. In looking at this from the perspective of the developer and the incentives that would be offered for development. And this is one of the questions that we've also received online. Given that developers in this community in Charleston tend to rely to some extent on outside investment, they need to maximize their profit in order to get a return on that investment. Is there sufficient incentive? Is there a sufficient carrot to bring people from the development community into these activities in a big way so that we can actually make a difference in the number of units that are available?
I think there are for-profit and not-for-profit developers that are looking to get into this arena. They just necessarily haven't had the infrastructure from a policy standpoint in order to do that. And I know a lot of the concern out in the community is, are they going to take these incentives and still not have market rate homes? And one of the things that we've really prided ourselves on with this community fund, and Bill's more of an expert on this, and I'll tee him up here, is but there's a state law from 2007 called the Mesher Act, which provides the infrastructure, so to speak, that these funds can be generated, but they're still also to be used for market rate affordable units as designed by the ordinance and policy language. So there are some checks in that regard to protect the consumer, but also there is an adequate pool of folks in the development community that do want to produce market rate affordable units in the area.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, I think that Josh is right. That the answer is, with regard to the housing referendum, it'll produce more, unquestionably produce more units than we have now. So it's another tool in the toolbox. And I think you need multiple tools in the toolbox. Jenny's absolutely right that you need better zoning policies. You need, perhaps incentives around density. Some areas of the country they're not just a carrot, but they have a stick. They require a certain amount of affordable units within if you're going to build 100 units of housing. And I don't know that we're there, but just trying to create, there are, if policymakers can think about, there's still money to be made if by conventional developers, if housing is a real market, if it's not an arbitrary market, it's a real market, just like the car makers can make a lower cost car and make money off of it, there's still money to be made for housing in that area as well. And so the question is, how do we set public policy, not only with something like a referendum like the one that's coming up, but how do you set other kinds of public policy that create the market conditions for that market to exist and for that kind of volume to come forth and for those developers to be able to play. Because I'll admit, like we will, Metanoia, a little group like us, other groups that are smaller nonprofit developers, hopefully will have access to these funds, but it is going to take deeper pockets and larger developers to really take a serious bite out of this problem. And it is going to be, this is going to help with that incentive, but they're going to need to be other incentives as well.
And thank you all for sort of making it clear that this is one of a number of approaches that are going to be necessary in order to address the problem of a lack of affordable housing in the Tri-County region. And I'll come back to that. But Jenny, I wanted to see if you had anything to add to this particular question.
You're on mute.
Certainly in the background, I apologize. I do think the question of incentivizing developers to come to the table is one of important concern. A lot of the regulations on this type of construction can be quite onerous. And so you end up getting a limited pool. So again, making sure that we are looking at all the options and keeping all of those pockets of incentives sort of open for consideration if this does in fact pass is important at this point so that we adequately address that.
Yeah, I would just add one other small thing. We do have a really great opportunity coming up in the form of the planned bus rapid transit line from Somerville to downtown. If you don't know about it, you should. Look at the COG. COG has a website about it, but there will be a rapid transit line, dedicated line from Somerville down to downtown. And that line needs density around it, and it's sort of the Rivers Avenue corridor. And it is a excellent opportunity for added affordable housing all up and down that corridor. There are still plenty of opportunities for conventional developers to do things on that corridor, and it really makes a great opportunity for public policymakers to really think proactively and intentionally about how do we create the right kinds of density on this corridor, use these incentives and other things, but really make this line a success and hopefully as an added benefit, reduce some of that traffic on I-26 that so many people spend so much time in every day. So,
and just to make sure that people are clear on what we're talking about here, this referendum would establish a fund that would be administered through a trust. Why is a housing trust the appropriate vehicle here? Why is that the best way to address this particular part of the problem?
Well, speaking of from the task force perspective, we looked at quite a few different options on how best to collect and administer the funds, and speaking with county council, speaking with county staff, they're not equipped to do the day-to-day real estate business. They have a lot of other concerns on their plate. And so we looked at someone who had the expertise in this specific field, which was the Community Loan Fund, is who we ended up working most closely with on this process. And they would be a third party who has experience dealing with these types of transactions. It is something that they qualify for from a lot of different points of view, and it fit a need that the county just didn't want to take on with all their other responsibilities. So that was how the trust was established. There are over 700, I think it's 780 nationwide trusts similar to this. So it's not we didn't create this out of thin air. This is a model that has been successful all across the country, and we feel that it can be easily replicated here and meet the needs that we're trying to accomplish here in Charleston.
Great.
Yes, and I will speak to a little bit of county council's thinking regarding that. Of course, I was not part of the task force, but there were members of council that expressed great concern over, trying to do this without very serious regulatory oversight, and felt like this model And I believe, if I'm correct, if the referendum passes, that there'll be an RFP out for whoever will administer this, but it will be set up in a fund that is regulated independently, so that there's plenty of oversight and it's not the county's responsibility. And again, that's to protect the public. These are public dollars that are to be for the public benefit. And members of council come and go, and we want that to be sustainable, and there's to be some continuity over the 20 years that these funds are collected. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the two groups you don't want managing a fund like this is development groups, myself included, even nonprofit development groups. We say we're the good guys, but we get, or forgive me, Councilwoman, politicians. Like it needs to be out of the realm of anybody who wants to use it strictly for their own ends, so that there is a people that really can look at deals, judge which ones do the most good for the most people, and those are the ones that win out. And creating sort of and having an RFP process where that is really at the center of it, and having groups demonstrate their capacity. We think what's called a community development financial institution, of which the South Carolina Community Loan Fund is one. They would be really well positioned to be able to bring that kind of work to the table. But they absolutely, whoever gets to steward these funds, and it's even in the Measure Act, they would have to provide annual reports. It'll be transparently run and operated, and those groups would have oversight. And if they didn't do what they said they were going to do, there would be recourse as well. And I think that's all important to realize and know and understand also.
And also, just for education and clarification, what's the role of this fund? Is it a direct lender? Does it work with developers? How does it engage in the process of actually connecting people to housing?
Yeah, so it would work with developers, and those developers would come to the fund and say, I'm going to build 10 units of housing, and without this added incentive coming in, it probably may be in the form of a low interest long-term loan, for example. Let's say it's 1 or 2% over 20 years, which is much more affordable than the lender could get otherwise. The lender basically says, because you're willing to give me that loan, or the developer, I will pass that affordability on to the end user, whether it be a homeownership situation, which that end user has to qualify for less of a loan to buy the house, or a rental situation, in which case the person has to pay lower rent. The developer is responsible for presenting a plan to the Housing Trust Fund, where they say, if you'll give me the better terms on the lending here, then I will be able to pass that affordability onto these units, and we'll lock that affordability in for a period of probably 10 to 20 years, something along those lines, probably at least the length of the term of any lending into the project from that source. And so it still allows developers to do their work and creates an added tool in their toolbox to enhance affordability. And especially if it's partnered with public policies that enhance density around affordability, for example, then it could be a really good tool, because it usually takes multiple ones of these tools to really make housing affordable. And I think the other advantage of this kind of a fund is because it is local. It can be a little more flexible than, we steward funding that ultimately goes back up to HUD, and it's full of, as you might imagine, it's got a lot of red tape associated with it, a lot of regulations associated with it. It sometimes gets more costly to use than it's hardly even worth. But because local funding can be a little more nimble within projects and be used to sort of fill gaps that help make housing more affordable, and pass that affordability on to the end users, the renters or the homeowners.
And just to reiterate, the funding for this would come from a 2 millage increase, the proposed 2 millage increase that Kenny was describing earlier. That translates into an extra, I think, $8 per $100,000 of owner-occupied property, and $12 per $100,000 of commercial or rental property. And is that intended to sunset according to the terms of the referendum? And then what would be the plan going forward?
Yeah, it has a 20-year time limit in the referendum, the way it's spelled out, the question itself. Can be bonded is the second question to voters. And I think the intent there, and this kind of segues from what Bill was saying, is these are loans. And so you actually it's sustainable in the sense that you're getting that money back with interest, low interest, but nonetheless, it carries forward. And so well-run funds around the country demonstrate incredible return. They are, very, you don't have a lot of default. And so again, in looking at the options and what would be the most sustainable, this was a very good model, given all of the options that were out there. So.
Yeah, it's important to note that the way this would work is it would not fund 100% of any project. It would be layered in. So what it does is it tends to also attract additional conventional financing. So for every dollar coming from the Housing Trust Fund, there's another $4 or $5 coming from other sources, including conventional banks. So it really attracts, if it's a $130 million bond, it could easily sort of get to a $500 or $600 million investment in the regional economy that will create jobs. Additionally, additional housing, reduce traffic, these kinds of things. So it can really be a catalytic effort.
Great. Thank you.
And it's anticipated those dollars would be leveraged in public-private partnerships with deals. And so those that can come to the table with actual land, because that's one of the biggest hurdles is land value, just the cost of the dirt, set aside the construction cost here. And so, yes, there's a way to leverage and really maximize those dollars.
And since we are talking about something that's going to be on the ballot that people are going to be voting on next week, there are some specific questions that we have in the Q&A that I want to make sure we get answers to so that people understand this as they're going in to make a decision on the referendum. And one of the recurring questions we're getting is, so if the measure is passed, what's the timeline to get this stood up and to get funds flowing into the projects?
And that's an excellent question. Again, that wasn't defined because we didn't want to jump ahead of the cart there, but there will be an RFP that goes out. And again, that's reflected in the minutes that discussed putting this up for a vote in front of council. And so, I would anticipate that would be done on a very efficient timeline, if you will, but I don't want to commit to anything at this point.
Yeah, and I think I could forgive you, speak for Josh and say those of us in the coalition would answer that question to say, as soon as capably possible. Like, we don't want anybody to rush anything and, do anything that's going to be halfway done, but we will be working to advocate, just like we worked to advocate to get it on the ballot in the first place, to assure that the process that comes forward is moving and that there is steady progress along the way, so that, I'd hope within a year or so we can have the right group identified and really be on our way to getting it launched. So,
Josh, you have anything to add to that?
No, I think they covered it pretty well. I know part of the discussion would be after the November decision, pulling the particular stakeholders back together to fill in some of the missing holes with the ordinance language and how it would be structured, what they would be, the criteria that the RFP would be set for. Some of those things would be put back in place, but it's our hope that once this passes, that county would work expeditiously to get the ball rolling, and we can start to see some fruits by the end of 2021.
And I'm going back to one of the first answers, maybe the first answer that Josh gave when he was talking about a lack of planning and a lack of attention to this, which is how we got here in the first place. And so I guess as we're talking about this as a strategy, and one of a number of strategies to address housing insecurity and affordability, how does community building play into this? As we're looking at creating access to these houses and to this housing, whether it's rental or owner occupied, are there any considerations about how we're building community as we're making housing accessible for people to stay on the peninsula or in areas where they'd otherwise have to move?
Yeah, well, I don't want to jump in, but I think that's a big question that we're trying to address. From the real estate perspective, we sell the idea of community. Without good communities, without good schools, without adequate access to groceries and, a food source, it's not much worth the residents that you're selling are renting. So it is a big part of how we plan and what we look at. As we look at this from a regional approach, prior to this meeting, I was meeting with a development group that was looking at that community planning question and how to address affordability downtown. And how does all those different factors that you just laid out, how do they play together in order to make a community whole? And I think those are things that we really have to address, because it's not just a roof and four walls that we're trying to identify here. We really have to get take a step back and look at the whole approach of making sure folks have access to all the amenities that we are trying to offer here.
Yeah, and I'd like to speak to that a little bit. When I got on council, we were looking at the decision of what to do with the Naval Hospital, and of course the redevelopment of Rivers Avenue. And Bill mentioned the Low Country Rapid Transit. I mean, in the next 10 to 20 years, that area is going to look very different. And so it was really important. While that area is not in my district, I was sort of fresh to the whole situation up there. I engaged with some stakeholders, and we started holding charrettes about the best way to move forward. And I think our community services center there is going to be an excellent resource for that area as we grow into the LRT, the hub and transfer stations right there as well. But more importantly, what it means to the community. And I will say my colleague, Mr. Darby, is a passionate advocate for his community. And I've learned so much in watching him advocate for his constituents. But it became readily apparent to me that it was extremely important when we were evaluating what we were going to do in planning new things for an area, that we be cognizant of how that affects folks that are there. Obviously, folks in that area have wanted a grocery store for a long time. So to Josh's point, having, available food resources and that kind of thing are really important. So yes, what it looks like to transform and get to where you're trying to go really requires community engagement and building relationships. And that has been actually one of the most rewarding parts of being an elected official, is to build those relationships when you really do care about the community and the effect of your policy making on those individuals.
Thanks, Jenny.
Yeah, to compliment all that, metanoia, that's sort of what we're in the business to do. And we've been buying property in partnership with a couple groups, Low Mission Alliance, Small Communities, the State Ports Authority, to sort of keep property affordable here. We've been land banking property with our partners. But I do want to quickly point to a study that sort of highlights some of this. So up in Prince George County, Maryland, they do have inclusionary zoning. So they require people building a certain number of housing units to make a certain number of them affordable. But they also have a school district that's adds extra funding to their Title I schools. And the folks at Johns Hopkins sort of saw this as a research project waiting to happen, because you have low-income kids getting more money than kids in wealthier district area schools, but you also have lower income students that are going to schools where they have wealthier peers because they're a part of this integrated housing. And the folks at Johns Hopkins realized that all students did better as a result of the interventions that they had, whether it be more money or being integrated in communities. But the students that did significantly better were actually the students that were integrated within the communities and not sort of warehoused over here in a high poverty school, even if that high poverty school is getting more money. And so it points to how housing is very much a transportation issue. It's an education issue. When we create the opportunities and the pathways to build more integrated communities, they become healthier for everybody. They reduce pollution, they reduce traffic, they increase educational outcomes. And I think an initiative like this has the ability to be a pretty significant tool. It's not everything, but it's a pretty significant tool that will point us in the right direction. And certainly it points to the value that we as a region place on everybody. I know there's some irony in passing what is effectively a very modest property tax increase to increase housing affordability. You're paying a little bit more for your house to get but it's a matter of how much we feel a sense of connection to each other.
Thank you, and thank you all for sharing those views. And Bill is like any moderator. I'm always happy when someone does my job for me, and Bill has queued up the next area that I wanted to go into, which is to ask about who's doing this well and where could we find some examples. I also know that Greenville is working on this issue, and in the spirit of rivalry across the state, the upstate appears to be a little bit ahead of the low country right now. What can we learn from Greenville? A question that will certainly make my friends in the upstate very happy. What is it that the low country can learn from Greenville?
Well, we have been sort of benchmarking those guys and looking at them, and they, you know, Greenville has this, just to let you know, Greenville has it, Savannah has it, Charlotte has it, Asheville has it. So like, yeah, we're doing some catch-up work here, but the good news is we can learn from somebody else's mistakes, you know, and so we have had several sessions with the folks in Greenville. They have been able to already kind of move towards leveraging, you know, really significant exponents of investment. I don't want to start quoting numbers because it's been a few weeks since we talked to them, and I can't remember, but it was really significant exponents of investment into the Greenville area for this, based on what was a fairly modest, you know, initial investment from the county. And so, at least compared to this, like I will say, what we can say is that this Charleston County referendum is pretty bold when you compare it to other markets in terms of what the sort of amount we're putting forward here on the first attempt. And so that's really great. It really has the ability to do something other than just sort of like a little bit here and there. It could really be very helpful. And so we ought to pat ourselves on the back in that regard. County Council ought to pat themselves on the back in that regard. So,
thank you.
Yeah, and I'll add that kind of what Bill just said. The mill increase is aggressive compared to our neighboring communities, but it also addresses the fact that we're starting from a disadvantaged point compared to our neighboring communities. They've been incrementally building over a couple years, a decade, whereas we're trying to take a bigger bite of the apple from the start. One of the things you mentioned, Greenville, that they've done better than us, and Ms. Honeycutt mentioned it early on, was how they incorporated housing affordability into their city and county build-out plan. You know, Charleston might have been more developed in that regards. We had a head start on them, but when Greenville really started to look at what they wanted to look like, housing affordability was part of the equation from the start. So as they looked at bonus densities and zoning restructuring and things of that nature, they were able from inception to get the ball rolling there and then incorporate the housing fund on top of that, which really gave them a leg up to where we're kind of piecemealing our approach and how we address the affordability issue here in Charleston.
Thanks, Josh. And that takes me to a comment that Jenny made earlier when she was listing the various approaches that we can use together to address this issue: zoning, density, whether they're density bonuses that we offer to developers, or simply designating areas to have denser residential development, and then a housing fund. How do we solve this problem? We're addressing the problem, but is this going to solve the problem?
Well, I'd like to speak to that because I recently was in a seminar that addressed some of the economic issues we're facing. And what we have to do is provide micro solutions to macro problems. If we looked at this as the huge, enormous problem that it is, we would think, well, this is unsolvable. We can't do this. How are we ever going to address this? Especially when you compound issues of racial tension and all of that kind of thing. And so it's very important that we look at the one piece a day that we can solve, and we make significant strides to get there. Because I do think sometimes, and I speak just broadly about issues affecting government, is you look at a problem that seems unsolvable, but when you break it down, and I'll give the North Charleston's a great example with respect to how they're treating the development of Rivers Avenue. It's like parking requirements. How simple would it be to reduce the number of parking spaces you need? If you're gonna build a bus rapid transit, you're trying to encourage people to use the transit system, not drive. Why would they need that many parking spaces? So we just have to apply those common sense micro solutions to these problems so that we can get one step closer each day. And before you know it, just like Greenville, who's been investing in this for a while, you do start to realize the bigger successes.
Thanks, Jenny.
I agree. I'm going to take more time than that. I mean, we are the fastest rising housing prices in the country. We're not in San Francisco yet. We're not in Washington, D.C. yet in terms of price points. We have the fastest rising housing prices in the country. So you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You have to take an incremental approach, and an incremental approach, there's nothing wrong with that, because you're going to make some mistakes and you learn some things, and then you get better at it, and then it gains momentum eventually. And so, you know, let's not think, you know, put our heads in the sand, because one thing is certain: if we don't do anything, it is going to get worse. And so we have to take some steps in the right direction.
Incrementalism is kind of our jam in South Carolina, so maybe that works well. And get some forward momentum on this and build on that momentum. Josh, were you gonna jump in?
No, I mean, I think they both hit it nail on the head. You know, the only thing that I would recommend is, you know, we not look at this as we're only taking a small fraction of a big problem. We didn't get to this problem by one large mistake. I mean, it was a lot of small mistakes along the way. So we just have to do subtraction here and take one piece away as we can. And you know, what is the frame is saying, you know, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. So I think that's what we're trying to do here, is address the problem, but it's not going to be the only way to solve the problem.
Thank you. And now I want to pull back a little bit from our evaluation of the problem and how to solve it to put it in context. This is a function of a system that Bill was describing earlier, that and Jenny just alluded to, that there is a racial component to how residential housing has developed and where people live, not just in Charleston, but across the country. We look at historic redlining that goes all the way back to the New Deal and who was eligible for loans and who wasn't. Part of what's underlying even current strategies is essentially an assumption that certain applicants aren't going to be approved for loans in a traditional mortgage market, so they'll have to go somewhere else. Is there something we can do about the systemic features that exacerbate this problem? And if so, what?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, this is getting beyond the sort of local level of this conversation so far, but like there is right now, you know, there's probably no federal law in the last like 25, 30 years that's done more to help this than the Community Reinvestment Act, which instead of told banks, basically, you need to stop playing by those rules and you play by a different set of rules where you really go after investments and for communities that have been left out. And right now that legislation stands to be weakened. And so, you know, it's also attending to things at those levels. I mean, I think this is a great local effort that ought to be celebrated. And yet we can't take our eye off the ball at the state level. You know, I'm thankful for William Cogswell, Marvin Van Darvis, who have endorsed it as an effort, but also have worked to get the state low-income housing tax credit passed, which is a great tool at the state level, and also the federal level, like attending to things like the CRA Act is really important. And so I think we have to look at all of it because it is all a part of a legacy and a history that we have to work at unwinding and making better for the future generation.
And then there are the reality are there are a lot of barriers to entry for home ownership that you know, it is just and access to capital is a big part of that. And how do we get folks into the housing market? You can look at some recent statistics by the Urban Institute. They have the Charleston metro area as the best in the entire country, believe it or not, at the equity issue. And we have a 15% gap between white home ownership and Black home ownership. And that's the best in the country, which is still a pretty significant gap. How do you get folks into home ownership when the median income, housing price is over $400,000 in the county of Charleston? We have to look at the wage issues in the area when housing is rising over the past decade at over 7% a year. Wages aren't keeping up with that. And then when you talk about the wage gap between white and black communities here in the Charleston area, it further exacerbates the problem to entry into home ownership. So there are a lot of systemic things that we need to look at. There's affordability is certainly part of that. We have to bring wages up to keep up with the home cost rise. So there's a lot of systemic issues that we have to address, and it's, as Bill alluded to, it's not just here in Charleston, it's a nationwide epidemic that has to be solved. And there are, again, a lot of solutions to a very big problem.
Gosh.
Yeah, and again, speaking beyond the subject matter here more broadly, I mean, wealth building generally begins with home ownership. I mean, for most people in America, their home is their single greatest asset. And so providing that opportunity for everyone is very important to start to equalize and close that gap.
Thanks, Jenny. So we've just got a few more minutes left. And the last question I have for you is, what would you like to share that we haven't covered yet? What's the one thing that you'd want to make sure we inject into this conversation that we haven't talked about yet?
I would just say, I think you've done a really great job, John. So I have to think for a second about what that would be. But I just think just to remember in your consideration of this referendum and your conversations about it, that at the end of all these numbers and at the end of all that, there are real people. There are people, there are not just people that need the housing that this would provide. There are small businesses that can't afford to hire their employees, at the price points they're able to pay. There are large businesses that have the same experience incidentally. I mean, this has become a major drain on our regional economy. And at every corner of the economy, the only reason the economy matters, in my opinion, is because there are people involved. The economy doesn't matter to me unless there are people somehow involved, and there are people being affected by this, and they're real people. And this is why those of us who do this are so passionate about it, because many of us know those people, and they're good people working hard, playing by the rules, and they contribute to our communities, and they don't deserve to be shoved out because of something like these pressures that have been created, not because of them. It's not their doing that these pressures got created. And so let's not put all the impact on them along the way. That's what sort of matters to us, I think.
Thanks, Bill.
Again, I feel the need to reiterate that I am not here to advocate for or against the referendum per se. However, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Ms. Johnson, Judge Rawl, who have worked incredibly hard since 2017 on trying to do just what we've discussed, and is to find one step forward to a solution for all of this. And so I appreciate the hard work, oftentimes very thankless effort, hours that they've put into this. And as I pitch it over to Josh, to thank him for his service on the task force and all that the task force stakeholders did to bring this together.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure that I should take too much credit here, but we kind of hit on it towards the middle of the program. And this is really a conversation about community. And as Bill mentioned, I'm really good at talking about numbers and policy, and that's kind of my speed. But at the end of the day, this is a very human element that we're trying to address here. And how do we get folks living close to not only where they work, but where do they go to church? Where are their public engagements at in the Charleston area? We need to make life easier, not harder, as we tout about recreation and quality of life. There's a lot of folks out there that aren't experiencing that high quality of life, and it's really about leveling the playing field on so many occasions, and making folks comfortable with where they are, and getting everybody who wants a home, getting them into that home that they so desire.
Thank you, Josh. And my takeaway from this is that while we're obviously consumed by national politics right now going into the
Let's
elections,
hope not.
we lose focus on the intensely local, not even the local elected races, but this is a chance for citizens to really make their voice heard on a local issue that affects their fellow residents and members of their community. So I would just encourage people to vote, uh, and 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 vote for reasons like this, if for no other reason, that this is about your community. This is about you making your voice heard in your community. And I'm grateful for the three of you lending your voices, and for Brittany for kicking us off so admirably. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.